All right, so this is my presentation from 2 weeks ago that I'm supposed to present on cut scores and sorry, not bookmark, the body of work examining centered standard centered method. Should I do the cut scores and go into the body of work, or just go into the body of work, Professor?
Both.
Both. All right. Right, so the objectives for today would be to review the concept of standard setting, to just review the definitions of standard setting, why standard setting, or the significance of standard setting, to just go into the different types of standards and to discuss cut scores in relation to the PLDs and performance standards, and also to define holistic standard setting, because the body of work method falls under the category of a holistic standard setting method. And just to go into to describe and discuss the body of work as a method for standard setting.
Just 1 second. Why dear letter take so much time? Because the body of work is an example of a psychometric standard setting that is very similar to the grade awarding. Go ahead.
Right, so I want to begin by saying that standards is in everything. I think that we use the term standards both formally, informally, sometimes intentionally or unintentionally. So therefore we could say standards is basically all around us. So for example, we have the store that they call standards because they using it in terms of like the ARA, APA, and NCME in terms of a guideline. So context is also important. We have standards in food safety, we have classroom standards, and we also have standards in terms of health and safety. So why standards, or what is the significance of standards? And Professor would have touched on this quite a bit, so I'm just going to review it quickly. It serves really as an engine for that defensible inference we make about those being classified. It also comes under part of the interpretive use validity argument. We also spoke about public trust and confidence, and I just want you all to remember the pictures that Professor Delisle would have shared in the first session, where we looked at the examples from, I think was it England? We had examples from Trinidad as well. So generally, the decision, once standard setting is being used, the decision lends itself to that fair, valid, and more efficient results. And we know right now NCME is discussing the DEI, which is really diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So standard setting and measurement theory can be used for different purposes. We have licensure, which is really in medicine and the health field, and in the US, and also certification, for example, the CAPE and so on. So there are different types of standards as proposed by CISAC and Bunch. We have content standards, performance standards, and standards as it relates to guidelines from ARA, APA, and NCME. So content standards, for example, this was pulled out from the Spanish curriculum. What are content standards? It describes really a set of outcomes or the curriculum objectives from that particular domain for which a test is constructed. So what they are saying is that student scores should be interpreted in terms of these content standards. So I think the issue here really is, are we really using the content standards, or is it just there that forms part of the document? So that is something important that we must look at, because I'm not sure if teachers are aware of that students' performance are supposed to be interpreted in terms of a content standards. All right. So now we're going to look at just now what happened here. Right. So now we're going to look at performance standards. And CISAC and Bunch stated that performance standards can be used interchangeably to mean a cut score, a passing score, or a standard. So performance standards here means the operationalization of deriving a cut point along a score scale. And ARA standards really here means the guidelines or some kind of accepted professional practice. And here we have the 2014 standards. They have it both in English and Spanish, so I found that to be really interesting. Definitions of standard setting, we can look at it from CISEC 1993, and I have highlighted here the key terms. So we really want to look at prescribed, that rational system of rules, the assignment of a number, and the degree of performance. Kane here touched on passing score, the score scale. So Kane really looked at it from a conceptual perspective, and CISEC and Bunch from a procedural way, kind of practically. So these definitions really kind of give us a holistic view of the construct, and this is what we really want in measurement, understanding the construct and defining it both procedurally and conceptually. So then we can conclude that standard setting is a methodology used to define levels of achievement or proficiency, and the cut scores must match each level. It's a process that refers to establishing single or multiple cut scores for a distinct purpose. These cut scores divide the distribution of examinees' test performance into two or more categories. So for example, a single cut score would be a pass-fail, award or deny a certain license, or grant or withhold a possible credential, as in, I think, the nursing exam would be licensing here. So cut scores are critical in terms of unintended negative consequences, and we want to remember MESIC here. It also assists score interpretation, and in terms of matter of life and death, in terms of the importance of that cut score, we can think about high stakes exams, especially in examination oriented systems like ours. And there is a relationship between cut scores and performance standards, and this was really put forward by CISEC and Bunch, and Professor Delisle would have showed us that diagram with the continuum. Okay, so interpretations based on cut scores according to AERA, APA, NCME 2014. They spoke about norm reference tests, and in order for us to understand norm reference, we just want to go back to what is norm reference test, and it's a framework for assigning grades on the basis of how a student's performance compares to other students in the class. So here, this is a comparison to other students. This is also important when we talk about standard setting methods, because one is based on the test and one is based on the work of the test taker or the examinee. So the standards are saying that tests used for selection appropriate, this is to rank order examinees. So norm reference, when you think norm reference, associated with some kind of ranking examinees, as in the SCA exam. So they are ranked according to their test performance, and they establish a cut score. So what they are saying is that it should be supported with reliable and valid evidence to make it defensible. For criterion reference, we want to go back to what is criterion reference. It is score. It's that score interpreting framework that compares a student's test performance against the domain of performances. So how much of the targeted learning did the students achieve? And in criterion reference, this is based on the student as opposed to the test. So qualitative descriptions attached to successive score ranges, a criterion reference is supported. The descriptions of proficiency level tasks, such as in a task scoring rubric, it enhances score interpretation by summarizing the capability that must be demonstrated to warrant a given score. So criterion reference is really performance standards, where you have your criteria, you have your performance level labels, performance level descriptors. This is an example taken from one of the standards for Spanish according to the Common European Framework of reference for languages. So here we can see beginner is A1 to A2. We have intermediate and advanced. This here is your performance level label, and this is the descriptor here. So someone who is at A1 for listening, this person should be able to recognize familiar words, basic phrases concerning myself, my family, immediate concrete surroundings when people speak slowly and clearly. So to define scores according to AERA and APNCME, it is a critical step in the development and use of some tests to establish one or more cut scores, dividing the score range to partition the distribution of scores into categories. And we would have done some sort, remember, partition from when we did reliability with Dr. Alexander. And what they're saying here is that a cut score, within a cut score, you can have more than one, and multiple cut scores are set to separate students into categories such as basic, proficient, advanced, and these are what we call the performance level descriptors. So a cut score is the point that sets some predetermined level where it differentiates between those who pass and those who fail. So if we want to visualize a cut score, for example, we can take this race or this hurdle to see here where fail, in this picture, the person would have failed this exercise, and between borderline here is the person didn't pass or didn't fail, so it's at the borderline. If we look here, you can see this person passes, goes over the hurdle, and excellent person is way above that hurdle. So this was just a little closer look into what borderline really looks like. Okay, so what stood out for me was this line from the standards, that such categorical decisions are rarely made on the basis of test performance alone. So what they're saying here is that some examinees are likely to pass and some are likely to fail. No test is perfect, and we would have done with Dr. Alexander that there's always some measure of variance, there's some sort of error in your test, and I remember that was the issue with the parallel test when we did our theory on statistics. So regardless of the cut score chosen, examinees with inadequate skills are likely to pass and vice versa. So this is what we term as classification error, and we can think of the COVID antigen test in this slide. So a false positive happens where an unqualified or an incompetent examinee gets the job, and a false negative is where someone who has the knowledge or skills, they fail. So for example, think about the danger in that. If we think about the COVID antigen test, imagine someone who is actually positive and they get a false negative. How much people they probably spreading that to. In the same way, if we think about our standards, our methods we use for that cut score, what is happening to when we deny someone. So this is why we need to be defensible, we need to document, and we need to have proper training for subject matter experts and for the judges, the panels that we use to arrive at the cut score. Even statistics models as well, such as logistic regression and so on, all of that will help with your defensibility. So the standards pointed out, standard 5.21 says, when proposed score interpretation involve one or more cut scores, the rationale and procedures used for establishing cut scores should be documented clearly. So you must document how the cut score was established, as I said before, for defensibility and validity. What is the role that the cut score plays in this whole process? And in test development, using the cut score to classify examinees into performance level descriptors. So standard 5.22 says that cut scores defining pass, fail, or proficiency levels are based on direct judgments about the adequacy of item or test performance. So for example, in an essay response writing prompt, or the scale that scores that characterizes that borderline examinee, the procedure used to elicit these judgments should result in some sort of defensible standard that reflects the standard set and participant values and intentions. So in other words, there must be some sort of congruency between the judges, the standard setting participants, and the KSA, or the knowledge, skill, and abilities that is expected from the test taker. Standard 5.23 says, when feasible and appropriate, cut scores defining categories with distinct substantive interpretations should be informed by sound empirical data concerning the relation of test performance on the relevant criteria. And I think this is where we are really lacking in our system in terms of using that empirical data, using that statistical model to really help us to be more defensible and to make proper score interpretations from what we are doing. So provide evidence, empirical data and stat model will help us to be more defensible. And I think this here really pertains to more credentialing, like those who are suitable or unsuitable, those who are successful, unsuccessful. But the test developer should investigate and report the relationship between test scores and performance in practical settings. Standard setting methods. So there are different methods that are categorized as test-centered or examinee-centered method for setting standards. So an examinee-centered method is where the judgment is on the test taker. As I would have mentioned earlier, we have that's-why norm reference and criterion reference is so important, as opposed to the test item in the test-centered method, for example, such as you have the Angoff, modified Angoff, and so on. So the examinee-centered method falls under holistic standard setting. So what is holistic standard setting? This is a procedure in which the main function is the evaluation of whole sets of the test taker or the examining work by one or more judges who render a single or holistic verdict about each work sample. This is from Sisek and Bunch. So the scores and ratings are combined for each test taker to yield a cut score. Or you can have one or more cut scores. So the judgments take the form of a rating, and this rating could be dichotomous in terms of pass, fail, and so on, or it could be ordinal, such as basic, proficient, advanced. So the body of work method is actually a holistic standard method. This was proposed by Kingston, Carl Sweeney, and Bay 2001. And this really evolved to include a diversity of item formats, such as constructed response items. And we know the difference between selected response, such as your MCQ and so on, and constructed response items, such as your essays and so on. So for example, we have written reflections, etc., essays, etc. So holistic methods require participants to focus their judgment on a collection of examining work, which is greater than on a single item at a time. So it's based on a collection and not looking at a single item. So participants assign samples of examinees' work performance to the various categories, example, pass, fail, dichotomous, or ordinal, basic, proficient, etc. So there are three main features of the body of work method that really distinguish it from other holistic method, and the first one is arranging work samples by total scores. So the panelists are unaware of the exact score of an examinee sample, and this is very important. You don't want to have any sort of biases or anything that could interfere with the scoring process. It also can be arranged from the low end of the set in a category. The second part is range finding and pinpointing. Now, round one is referred to as range finding, and this is where a sample of the work that is basic, it can be taken out of the set and replaced by additional samples with scores near the score point. That is referred to as round 1. So range finding is that systematic removal of work samples between rounds. Round 2 they refer to as pinpointing. And then I'll go into pinpointing a little bit more in a bit. So logistic regression is the statistical method. It's a data analytic technique that helps to mitigate any kind of miscalculation of midpoints, such as means and medians in the range finding or round 1 phase. So procedures of the body of work method, we have 3 procedures: training, range finding, and pinpointing, and calculating that cut score, which is the logistic regression. So under training, right, so under training, they should be, what is important here is that the judges become familiar with the performance level descriptors. This is very important. So for example, category, let's say the category advanced, the judges should know what that looks like, what is the quality for training. Yeah, and in training you have a practice round so that they can examine samples, so it's kind of like a simulation. In range finding, they examine work samples and range it from low to high raw score. So this round serves as roughly determined cut scores. For round 2, pinpointing, I will look at that just now. Let's take a look at an example for range finding. So this was taken from Lisizak and Bunch. And for range finding, samples are assembled in folders, as you can see folder numbers here, and they are arranged in score point order within a folder. So this table shows ratings of 12, hold on, this is blocking, of 12 participants, 12 panelists, sorry, of 30 student work samples. Right, so they are organized into 10 folders. You can see we have 10 folders, and in folder 1 we have 3 samples, 13, 15, and 16 with a raw score. So folder 1 contains 3 samples with the lowest score being 13. Then we have 15 and 16. Folder 2 contains 3 samples as well, with scores 17, 19, and 20. So each line shows the distribution of panelists' ratings for the work samples in a folder. In folder 1, the work sample that received a raw score of 13, of the 12 participants, all 12 would have judged this work sample to be below basic. With a raw score of 16 in folder 1, if we look here, we can see that 10 panelists or participants judged this work to be below basic as well. So the range finding process starts where panelists examine each sample in each folder and enter a rating, what we call the performance level descriptors, for each sample on a special form. And this is what the form looks like. So they complete this form and then they submit it. So for round 2 pinpointing, it's really the same as round 1, but it's really to review work and assign each to a performance level, except that the folders contain samples with scores in the narrowed range of raw scores from round 1. Calculating cut scores, you can use logistic regression, which is an analytical procedure used to calculate the final cut score. So the main objective of logistic regression is to identify a raw score at which the probability of being assigned to a given level, it equals or exceeds that of being assigned to the next lower level. That is where P should be 0.50. So for example, a raw score of 20, let's just go back to the cut score table. Right, so for example, a raw score of 20 is here. there is a 50% chance, because we've seen 6 and 6, so there's a 50% chance of being assigned to the basic level. 6 out of the 12 entries are at this level, right? So there's a 50% chance. A raw score of 21, if we find raw score of 21, the likelihood of that being assigned to basic is 7 out of 12, because we have 12 panelists. So that is, say, about 58%. A raw score of 39, if we look at 39, we can see 6 and 6. That's a 50% chance, likelihood of being assigned to advanced as proficient. So therefore we can say that above 39, more likely assigned to advanced. So 39 here seems like a good cut score between proficient and advanced. So some advantages and disadvantages of the body of work method. Hambleton, as cited in Petunia, noted that one advantage of this method is that it allows panelists to provide judgments about the overall performance of a test taker rather than focusing on the performance of individual items. Some disadvantages is that some researchers would have stated that it's actually a more complex method. It requires more work. The challenge is that it encompasses a body of work rather than single items, hence body of work method. So more work is needed to explore why it often produces higher cut scores, so more research is needed than other methods. Also, if we were to apply the body of work method in our context, it means that we would need a lot of training for judges, for people to be making that score interpretation on you. So we have to be careful who we are putting in those seats to do that, to make that judgment. So the evaluation of the body of work, to evaluate this method, Radwan and Rogers would have grouped it into two in terms of practical adequacy, its practicality, and its technicality, technical adequacy. So what he means by practical adequacy is that it should be easy to implement, easy to compute in terms of the statistical models and so on. It should be easy to interpret to lay people, and lay people here meaning the public, a normal person. So we want to remember here the score reporting and so on in standard setting. It should be easy for everyone to be able to understand, and it should be credible as well. In terms of technical adequacy, it should be able to yield validity evidence and identify a true standard. It should be statistically sound when we're using logistic regression and so on. It also should be sensitive to examining performance and yield appropriate classification information. So to end today, I just want to bring in a little bit of Dr. Alexander's statistical, when we're doing tests and so on, the assumptions are so important, and Professor Delay just mentioned that as well. In the same way, the score interpretations that we make is also so important. So there's some cuts in terms of the relationship between the two. It's so important for us to be careful of the kind of interpretations we make. And that's the end.
Ramona, excellent. And I like that picture at the end. That's Tracy's boy and me favorite man. Yeah, he's a great man. And he checks all the assumptions first. Well, that's a little weird, but great, fantastic, excellent. Yes, I'll be case clapping. We'll ask the questions next week because we